The legendary Enzo Ferrari once said that horsepower sells a car, but torque wins races. When it comes to American muscle cars, he was absolutely right. What really sold them was horsepower. It would seem such a common parameter as horsepower should be the same always and everywhere, because it is used everywhere for more than 2 centuries. But that's not the case. Not only do American mechanical horsepower differ from European ones, but there are also different methods for measuring power. However, while the variance between American HP and German PS might be a mere few percentage points, trivial for the layperson, the methodology used in measuring can substantially alter the outcome that ultimately gets highlighted in promotional materials. And precisely this number, representing the car's horsepower, will drive its sales. At least that was the case in America during the golden era of muscle cars, when buyers hardly fretted over fuel economy. The engine power of American cars was gauged using the so-called gross power, or SA gross standard, implying that the engine's bench test was conducted not only without a muffler and air filter, but also devoid of any add-on equipment, and only in 1971 was a new net power standard, known as SAE, introduced, which required manufacturers to measure engine power differently, with the muffler and air filter attached, but still without accounting for transmission losses. Essentially, this is how engine power is measured in modern cars. It is this power that is indicated in factory specifications. The power at the flywheel, not at the wheels. During 1971 and 1972, many automakers began listing both power figures in their specifications. For example, the famous 1971 Chevrolet Chevelle SS 396 had 300 horsepower according to the SAE gross standard, but only 260 horsepower by the SAE net standard. Earlier, the horsepower figures reported by manufacturers for most, if not all, muscle cars were undervalued by 5, 15, 25, or even more percent. The result was evident. All the power consumed by auxiliary equipment and mufflers was well compensated by the extra horsepower that the manufacturer conveniently forgot to mention in the promotional materials. But why would they understate the declared power when, according to the logic of that time, the more power, the better the sales? There were 3 reasons. First, political correctness, which significantly affected General Motors, the most conservative American auto giant of the 60s. Manufacturers genuinely feared lobbyists pushing for safety and environmental laws at a time when excessive power, reaching 400 horsepower and beyond, suddenly became accessible to a broader segment of the population. The second reason for understating actual power was the cost of insurance. The higher the power, the greater the risks, and consequently, the higher the insurance costs, ultimately leading to lower sales. The simplest solution for manufacturers was to reduce the declared power in the specifications, which no one could verify, thus appeasing both insurers and government officials concerned about road safety. However, the combined influence of these 2 reasons pales in comparison to the impact of the third and most important factor: racing, specifically the drag racing competitions held by the National Hot Rod Association, NHRA. "Win the race today, sell tomorrow" was a relevant slogan even before NASCAR became the main pastime for American auto enthusiasts in the late 60s. Before that time, fans' attention was focused on drag racing, particularly in the stock category, where cars competed with factory specifications. The National Hot Rod Association, NHRA races, were broadcast on federal channels. Rock bands wrote songs about them, and TV producers featured dragsters in their shows. One such car even appeared in the famous series Star Trek. To qualify for the stock category, 2 key parameters were crucial for a car: curb weight and declared power. It was evident that the greater the actual power exceeded the declared power, the higher the chances of winning a race. There was a substantial demand for understated power figures in the documentation, and manufacturers were eager to fulfill this demand. Manufacturers used some crafty methods, and for a time, all interested parties chose to overlook it. The horsepower figures listed in brochures weren't arbitrary. They were measured at RPM levels where the engine's peak power hadn't been reached yet. Additionally, manufacturers could manipulate bench test conditions, such as altering the temperature of the incoming air or restricting its flow, to make the engine appear less powerful than it truly was. These power rating manipulations were an open secret. As soon as a new model hit the market, journalists from American auto magazines would rigorously test it. Rumors that the actual power exceeded the declared figures were widespread among almost all American muscle cars, known as supercars at the time. By the late 60s, it was common knowledge among those interested in the automotive world. Roger Huntington developed a mathematical algorithm that allowed for determining the actual gross power of a car's power unit based on its dynamic performance. In simple terms, he identified the relationship between engine power, vehicle weight, acceleration time to 60 miles per hour, quarter-mile time, and exit speed. Roger Huntington authored no fewer than a dozen books dedicated to American cars of the classic era and tuning their engines. Additionally, he was a member of the Society of Automotive Engineers, SAE, the same organization that developed the ISO and gross standards and remains one of the most influential organizations in the automotive, transportation, and aerospace industries in the United States. Next, let's delve into the actual gross horsepower figures of the 10 most outstanding power units and cars of the golden era of American muscle cars. As mentioned earlier, in 1971, the 396 6.6-liter V8 engine under the hood of the Chevrolet SS 396, with a displacement of 402 cubic inches, had a power output of 300 horsepower. We are interested in the actual power, which, according to Huntington, was 400 horsepower at 5,600 RPM. The maximum torque developed by the engine with a 4-barrel carburetor was 563 Newton-meters, achieved at 3,600 RPM. According to Huntington, the torque figures listed in the promotional brochures for all models were fairly accurate, as neither the leadership of the Hot Rod Association nor the insurers paid much attention to them. To recap, according to the manufacturer, the 1970 Chevelle SS 396, with a 3-speed hydromatic automatic transmission, could accelerate to 60 miles per hour in 6.4 seconds and complete the quarter mile in 14.5 seconds. Ford FE Series V8 428 Cobra Jet engine first appeared under the hood of Mustangs in the fall of 1968. With a displacement of 428 cubic inches, or exactly 7 liters, the engine produced, according to Ford, only 335 horsepower at 5,200 RPM and 603 Newton-meters of torque. Notably, at the same time, Ford offered a more compact 390 V8 engine with a displacement of 6.4 liters in the same Mustang, which also claimed the same 335 horsepower as the nearly race-ready Cobra Jet 428. Any car enthusiast with some knowledge understood that there had to be a significant difference in power between these two engines. They also knew that a 1.5-ton Mustang 428 Cobra Jet simply couldn't accelerate to 60 mph in under 6 seconds with just 335 horsepower. And indeed, it couldn't, because according to Huntington's calculations, the actual power of the Cobra Jet engine was closer to 410 horsepower, reached near the upper limit of the tachometer at 5,600 RPM. Chrysler RB Series V8 440 Magnum Super Commando. The 440 7.2-liter V8, known as the Magnum by Dodge and the Super Commando by Plymouth, was not only one of the largest engines of its time, but also one of the most popular. This was due to its relatively simple maintenance requirements and lack of need for constant adjustments during operation. Producing a whopping 651 Newton-meters of torque, the Magnum and Super Commando engines were rated at 375 horsepower, achieved at 4,600 RPM. But when revved a bit higher to 5,400 RPM, the peak power, according to Huntington, reached its actual mark of 410 horsepower. This makes it clear why the 1969 Plymouth GTX with the 440 Super Commando under the hood could reach a quarter-mile speed of 165 kilometers per hour, about 102.5 miles per hour, and complete the run in just 13.7 seconds, earning a place among the top 20 fastest classic American muscle cars. GM Pontiac 400 V8 Ram Air IV. The 6.6-liter monster, the Ram Air IV, was the most powerful civilian engine in Pontiac's lineup of Ram Air 400 engines, which included 5 versions. While the Ram Air V was intended only for racing cars, the Ram Air IV was ordered by street racing enthusiasts who wanted to turn their Pontiac Firebird into a rocket on wheels. Despite this, the declared power of this engine was not extraordinary. just 366 horsepower available at 5,100 RPM. The only explanation for its 6-second sprint from 0 to 60 mph and 14-second quarter-mile times was the actual power of the engine, which, according to Huntington, was 410 horsepower at 5,600 RPM. GM Buick Big Block V8 455. With a 0 to 60 mph time of 6 seconds and a quarter-mile time of 14.4 seconds, the 1970 Buick GS 455, with its 360 horsepower and 692 newton-meters of torque, seemed unimpressive compared to competitors with large V8s under the hood. If we ignore the torque figure, all the other specifications of the Buick GS 455 were not particularly remarkable. But when you consider these numbers, the inconsistencies become glaringly obvious. A 7.5-liter engine with only 360 horsepower, yet nearly 700 newton-meters of torque? Clearly, Buick was understating something. The real power of the engine became evident after Motor Trend published the Buick GS 455's quarter-mile performance, showing a time of 13.38 seconds. This performance ranks the 1970 Buick GS 455 in 9th place among the fastest classic muscle cars. And it's clear that it wasn't just the claimed 360 horsepower achieving these results. In reality, when the engine is revved to 5,400 RPM instead of the manufacturer's stated 5,000 RPM, its power can reach 420 horsepower. This explains the significant difference between the actual and declared acceleration times. Ford 385 Series V8 429. The 7-liter Ford 429 V8 from the 385 series appeared in the Mustang as a response to the similarly sized Chrysler 426 Hemi, a dominant force on the NASCAR ovals. The first civilian model to feature this engine was the 1969 Mustang Boss 429. Given the engine's racing pedigree, no one doubted that the modest 375 horsepower rating was merely a nod to environmentalists, safety advocates, and insurers. Today, the Boss 429 is considered not only the best Mustang of all time, but also one of the most outstanding cars from the classic muscle car era. This is due to its aggressive looks and, of course, its breathtaking quarter-mile performance of 13.6 seconds. Rumors circulated that with the right knowledge and skills, the 429 Ford V8 could be pushed to 9,000 RPM, potentially exceeding 600 horsepower. However, Huntington was less optimistic in his calculations. He estimated the engine's peak power at 5,600 RPM, reaching 420 horsepower. The primary, though not the only, difference between the Chrysler 446-pack and the base Magnum or Super Commando engines was the presence of 3 2-barrel carburetors instead of a single 4-barrel one. The declared power of these engines was 390 horsepower at 4,600 RPM, but according to Huntington, at 5,600 RPM, the power increased to 430 horsepower. The 6-pack engines attracted buyers with their reliability, ease of maintenance, and most importantly, their price, almost half the cost of the 426 Hemi, while delivering nearly the same performance. The most convincing proof of the speed of cars, equipped with the 446-pack engines, is the 1969 Plymouth Roadrunner, which, with a quarter-mile time of 12.91 seconds, is considered the third fastest classic American muscle car. GM Oldsmobile Rocket V8 455. There was a time when the trio of Buick, Oldsmobile, and Pontiac, collectively known as BOP, was considered somewhat of an underdog within General Motors' brand hierarchy. Among them, Oldsmobile was often seen as the outsider, always trailing behind. Yet, it was Oldsmobile that installed the most powerful engines in its cars among the BOP group. The 455 7.5-liter V8 was used by all 3 brands, but it was particularly prominent in the Oldsmobile Cutlass 442, which had a declared power output of 365 horsepower. As an option, a slightly enhanced version of the engine, designated by the code W30, was offered. According to the manufacturer, it produced just 5 more horsepower, bringing the total to 370. However, it was puzzling how a car weighing almost 1,700 kilos could complete the quarter mile in just 13.88 seconds. Huntington found the answer. If you measure the engine's power not at 5,300 RPM, but at 5,600 RPM, the 370 advertised horsepower becomes an impressive 440 real horsepower. Chrysler Hemi 426, V8 Street Hemi. The 426 Hemi, also known as the Elephant, is truly a legend in the automotive engine world. This 7-liter V8 engine with hemispherical combustion chambers made a significant impact on the muscle car era. Developed initially for racing, the 426 Hemi was introduced to the road cars by Dodge and Plymouth between 1965 and 1971. Manufacturer stated figures for this engine boasted 425 horsepower and 664 newton-meters of torque. The engine was known for its high rev capabilities, reaching the red line around 7,000 RPM easily. While officially the power output was stated at 425 horsepower at 5,000 RPM, there were rumors suggesting that in its stock form, the engine could produce up to 500 or even 600 horsepower. However, realistic estimates, based on extensive testing, have often shown a more credible figure of around 470 horsepower at 6,000 RPM, which seems plausible given that the fastest classic road car with this engine, the 1970 Hemi Cuda, was slightly slower than the Plymouth Roadrunner equipped with the 440 engine from 1969 by only 0.19 seconds in quarter-mile tests. The peak torque for both engines was the same at 664 newton-meters, but the 440 engine achieved this at 800 RPM earlier than the Hemi. This fact points to one reason why the Cuda might have been slower. It delivered its peak power and torque at higher RPMs, which could affect acceleration times at lower speeds. GM Chevrolet Big Block V8 427 L88. In an interesting comparison, the GM Chevrolet Big Block V8 427 from 1967, known as the L88, was a paradoxical beast. It was intended for track use, but was legally allowed on public roads. GM didn't actively promote it to the general public and hoped it wouldn't be widely purchased. Only 116 units were sold, primarily to professional racers. The L88's advertised power was just 430 horsepower, but real-world testing suggested a figure closer to 480 horsepower. GM Chevrolet LS6 454 V8. Finally, it must be said that the most powerful production power unit of the classic muscle car era was GM's 454 Big Block V8, designated LS6, with a claimed gross power of 450 horsepower and a torque of 678 newton-meters. This engine is in our list at number 11, since Huntington for some reason did not mention it in his research. Most experts agree that the claimed power of this behemoth, whose displacement in the units we are familiar with, was 7.4 liters, like other large engines of the era, produced more horsepower than the manufacturer indicated in the brochures. In its best form, the LS6 V8 engine was available only in 1970, being installed under the hood of the Chevrolet Chevelle SS 454 model. It endowed the nearly 1,700-kilogram machine with dynamics not just comparable to, but even surpassing, those of European muscle cars, equipped with six-packs and other powerful engines. Journalists from CarCraft managed to record the shortest quarter-mile time of 13.12 seconds with an exit speed of 172 kilometers per hour. This clearly indicates that the real power of the engine must have been no less than that of those six-packs and Hemi.